afternoon, everybody. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our Hurricane Outlook and Discussion for Friday, June 10th, 2022. Um, Couple things to go over today regarding Atlantic and the activity, which is for now not anything at all. And there's also an area out in the East Pacific to watch, but long range models are starting to hint at some short term, at some Atlantic activity, and there is also hints of something that we have over the United States. We'll get everything more in depth in a moment, but first, I want to welcome you in on a Hurricane Outlook and Discussion. If you like what you saw today, please, as I always say, subscribe, like the video. It really helps with the YouTube algorithm, of course, getting as always, as you know, YouTube, to try to get people to notice you, it always comes through subscribers and likes, which is a pretty obvious thing. So really, if we want to grow this channel, we will really have to, I really do ask you personally to help to grow this channel by just subscribing and liking. Subscribing is free, so I don't see a issue with doing so. But of course, you don't have to if you didn't like what you saw today. But that's fine. But besides all of that, let's get straight into everything we need to talk about today. And of course, that is not really that much in the Atlantic. There's no tropical cyclone activity expected for the next 48 hours or the next 5 days. However, the same cannot be said in the Eastern Pacific because there is a storm there that is associated with some upper level clouds, not upper level clouds, but a broad, elongated area of low pressure that is off the coast of southwestern Mexico. And this is producing disorganized showers and thunderstorms, and it looks like things might be favorable for this to form. And this will meander off the coast of Mexico. Some models take it in, some models don't do much with this in terms of impacts to Mexico, or just meander this off the coast. But of course, once this forms, we'll have a better idea of what it tries to do. But of course, as always, since this will be forming not too far from the Mexican coast, the southwest Mexican coast, of course, those along the coast do need to be watching, especially after the wake of Agatha just a few weeks before, which was a pretty intense hurricane, if you do remember. All right, just really quickly taking a look at the sea surface temperature anomalies, as we always do. Once again, very entrenched in a La Nina state in the Atlantic, in the Pacific, not the Atlantic. Sorry, getting things a little confused today. That's fine. I didn't get a lot of sleep last night, so I guess that kind of explains it. But a lot going on, of course, with the La Nina. It's still persistent. However, it has kind of fizzled out a little bit. We've seen westerly winds with the MJO as it progresses from the Pacific into the Atlantic, which is also, in turn, why we're seeing all of this activity. So far, we had Alex. Now we're having some activity in the Eastern Pacific, and models are starting to hint at some long-range activity in the Western Caribbean and the Bay of Campeche. But we'll get to that shortly. But the MJOs come in. We've seen westerly winds and kind of tamed off the La Nina here, but it's still very much a La Nina, if not at least a cool neutral, which is still very good for the hurricane season in the Atlantic because we do not see any widespread warmth across the Pacific that would focus the energy there and take it off of the Atlantic. And of course, with the focusing energy, rising motion over the Pacific, which is what we typically see in an El Nino, would inhibit the Atlantic by westerly winds over the upper levels. And without those warm waters, we won't have the energy and the rising motion, which is what we have now in a La Nina or even a cool neutral in general, because there's no El Nino and not enough energy either way to focus activity in the Pacific. So either way, it's good for the Atlantic. And it's especially good when we see this right here. Warm waters across the entire Atlantic, basically. Of course, the subtropics are cool, and that is actually even more of a favorable sign because we will see a lot more of concentration of the warmth in the Atlantic, and that's already obvious. Look at the MDR, entirely above normal, maybe not to the extreme extent of '05 or 2010 right now at least, but it's still well above normal. The Gulf too, and we'll take a look at the sea surface temperatures, the actual raw sea surface temperatures in just a moment, but it really is favorable, and it really is, of course, ready for development this year, and that'll be something we'll need to watch very closely as, of course, we get closer towards the peak, and it'll definitely be an active season for sure. But of course, for now, if we take a look at what's going on across the Atlantic, well, what do we see? This is the satellite, and of course, you can see just really quickly with that East Pacific disturbance, you see a broad area of disorganized showers is what is associated with the disturbance right now. This is also what I've been talking about, this real potent system moving across the southern United States. This is associated with what we call a mesoscale convective system, and I did see that there was some interest of something along with this front that's coming off the East Coast, this huge troughing activity that we see moving across the United States right now, a front which will then situate itself, of course, across the East Coast next week. And I'm not sure if this is the system that'll be associated with it, but bottom line, it is some sort of mesoscale convective system, much like this one, and even this itself, we can't even rule out of doing something, of course, since if we'll once again, especially if we take a look at where we're looking at this forming, which will be along the Gulf Stream, or this will be going over with the waters. It's going along very warm waters here, of course, across the Gulf. And we always know how these fronts work, that usually the tail end of the front does tend to have a little bit more in terms of convective activity. Low pressure sometimes loves to form along the tail end of cold fronts, and especially when it comes to June and July, and even May too, when we have these fronts that still come off the East Coast, but of course they start to tamper down as we get closer towards the summer and we have a huge Bermuda high build. When we see these fronts come off and we see a low pressure break off, the difference of this occurring during the winter and spring and this occurring in the early summer is that there's actually warm waters for this to, I guess, habilitate, I guess, development and allow for something, or for at least a low pressure to form, and then whether or not it just comes to the shear, if this will organize or not, or if this has enough convective activity. But as we've seen, especially over the past few years, these systems do tend to spin up and bring some short notice storms that do really quickly spin up, either move in or just move along the Gulf Stream out to sea. Nonetheless, we'll see whether or not things will be favorable. And of course, along the East Coast, where we do see that front coming off, behind the front, there's a lot of shear associated with the trough, but ahead of it, some pretty strong, some pretty low values, up to down to 5 knots in some areas, and of course, indicated by the green. That means go for development, but of course, as expected for June across the actual tropical Atlantic, we have a bunch of very strong shear values. Of course, in the red, that is very much unfavorable for development, but it's June and we really shouldn't be expecting much. And then as we go towards that area in the Eastern Pacific, you do see right here, it's all the way on to the far left side, I guess. It's a little bit inconvenient to see, but as we do see right where that area is in the East Pacific, all the way out, you could see greens, and that's why we're expecting this to possibly develop, because we see greens when it comes to upper level winds. That means the environmental conditions will be favorable, and of course we might see something form in turn. And as I did mention earlier, mesoscale convective systems that will be moving off, as will be moving off the coast, associated with a front, as I did mention earlier, much like something like this. That's kind of advancing southward towards the Gulf. Eric Webb does mention that a mesoscale convective system has potential to move off the southeast coast and get trapped under a bird burgeoning subtropical ridge to the north. I never saw this word, even though I know English, and English is my first, or I guess second language, I guess. I never saw this word, so sorry for mispronouncing that. But bottom line, what Eric Webb is saying is that we'll have a huge high pressure to the north over the Great Lakes. And as we saw, just much like this storm that's moving off associated with this huge troughing over the United States, it's going to move off the southeast coast, and a ridge over top of it might favor, as for what Eric Webb is mentioning, might favor some development off the southeast coast next week. And of course, there's the warm waters there, and there's also the favorability when it comes to the environment, at least for right now. And he does mention that it's always worth mentioning during hurricane season, of course, warm waters, and of course, more favorable atmospheric conditions, of course, associated with this. But Eric Webb, I do want to did bring up some more important things when it comes to hurricane season. And this was a recent talk, of course, that he always does when it comes to climatology and kind of bunching together the pieces of the puzzle, as we always talk about. and also other people talk about too, bunching together the pieces of the puzzle for a hurricane season. And he did mention that this year, which what we typically see when it comes to a wet West African Sahel, which is basically the West African monsoon, the Sahel region of Africa, where we see the tropical waves and the West African monsoon and something like that in a wet year, and the positive Atlantic meridional mode, which is basically associated with the warm waters in the main development region, which is positive, of course, because we have warm waters there. He notes he put together this composite, and this is what it shows. He mentions it has that years with these typical background associations. One thing he does show is typical within these seasons that have these things. He noticed that he does mention that there is a huge track density that occurs in the Western MDR and into the Lesser Antilles, and that is a very interesting sort of thing because we have not seen, especially when it comes to Lesser Antilles activity and also island Caribbean threats, we have not seen much of that since 2017 at all. And I see every year, a lot of people every year constantly bring up the threat of the Lesser Antilles. And we do have the background state, of course, this year mentioning that we do see in general a lot of tropical activity in the actual tropical Atlantic. Because for one, if we do see the dense track activity is within the main development region bounds too, and of course factoring La Nina, it's really not that out of the norm that we would see a lot of tropical Atlantic deep tropics focused development this year, especially given a La Nina, and we would see a lot more energy focused in the deep tropics. But this will be very interesting for sure. And it's a very interesting thing that Eric Webb did bring it up because, especially when it comes to long trackers this season, this is something that is definitely interesting and is definitely a point to bring up. And then he did show wet Sahel years in the Atlantic, and of course, as noted, there's a very high track density across the deep tropics and also the Western Atlantic. So that is interesting too, especially when it comes to Atlantic seasons and it comes to the development of this hurricane season. But of course, it'll always be worth it to watch and wait and see what exactly happens. And of course, we'll see how things develop this season, bearing in mind the conditions we do have, which is always very important. All right, but just really quickly going over the GFS when it comes to just to see what's out there, just to see if we do have any development, of course, in the Atlantic. And of course, one thing we do see is what we're basically looking for here is just taking a look at the GFS and seeing are there any bundles of energy, bundles of vorticity that might be trying to get together and clump and become organized enough to be some interest for tropical activity. And across the Atlantic, across the deep tropics of the Atlantic, I guess that one area here that's not really anything too worth note, but as he does, as of course, as Eric Webb mentioned before, a lot of troughing over the Atlantic, and of course, this front that comes off the East Coast. One thing we do see, you see that right there, a small little low pressure kind of breaks off, and then it moves southward away from the coast of the United States. Other ones before had it moving towards the United States, but I guess this one kind of keeps it moving away. But one thing you do see, it's still a piece of energy that once again associated with this front and associated with the mesoscale activity that'll come with it, moves off the southeast coast and possibly develops into something as associated with what Eric Webb said. And then besides that, the other interests of activities, we take this up to hour 240. Of course, we have our East Pac development here, which is in the much shorter range, and we're much certain on that. But there's also hints, of course, of this Atlantic development activity that might be starting to occur around the hour 240 time and a little bit earlier before that. And that's also associated with the same general atmospheric pattern that's in the East Pac right now. And it's moving over to the Atlantic, the MJO, of course. It will start favoring things in the Atlantic more soon. And of course, people have talked about this for weeks, June being very favorable. And the models have begun to hint at something indeed forming around the hour 240 region. And of course, the GFS as always has gone crazy with showing a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. This one, though, they actually don't, and they actually do show something that's a little bit more tame. And of course, though, even though it's 240 hours out, it's always worth noting because the GFS and there's also Euro ensembles too, hinting at something. So, of course, as always, this will be interesting to see what exactly does happen. And of course, we'll be monitoring that too. And hey, look, you see this nice little long area here. I guess some pretty potent vorticity coming off the coast of Africa as a sign that we do have a strong tropical wave. And of course, also a sign that indeed we are very much into hurricane season. As always, when we get these strong tropical waves, you definitely know the environment is starting to shift and we're starting to see more favorability towards the hurricane season. But other than that, there's really not too much else to worth note. Of course, that thing off the East Coast, as we did mention, is something small. And of course, even though it might spin up to something, it won't be something crazy, of course, as typically we don't see much of that till later on in the year. And then we have whatever is going to develop in the Western Caribbean. That's still far out in time, and that could still very much change. But of course, one thing too, as I did mention, I would talk about before, is the sea surface temperatures and whatever would come off the southeast coast. Well, look at that. We have very warm sea surface temperature waters solidly in the 28 and even 29 degrees Celsius threshold, as marked earlier. The Gulf, too, if anything, were to come down there and develop along the front like we usually see with these early season storms that try to be quick spin ups. The Gulf and even the southeast coast too are very favorable for it. And as we mentioned before, the Gulf is very, very warm. And even out here in the Atlantic too, of course, not the entire main development region is as warm for development yet, but the western MDR, noticing 27s, 26s starting to make their way into the central MDR. And of course, as we get closer towards peak season, it'll spread throughout the rest. But focusing in on the Gulf, and of course, looking at the Gulf, what we can see is obvious, very warm sea surface temperatures, 29s, even shelf waters, and they're shelf waters, and so they really don't have too much as much as the actual waters themselves. But still, shelf waters, even if you do see here right by the coast of Louisiana, 30 degrees Celsius when it comes to shelf waters. So, I mean, this is really something we need to watch and something that is really interesting as we go towards hurricane season. Obviously, it doesn't pose a threat to us now because there's nothing in the Gulf to talk about and there's nothing taking advantage of this. But if this were to hold and, of course, get warmer, as, of course, we do see things get warmer as time goes on, that would be very interesting and it would definitely be something to watch, especially when it comes to activity later on in the year. This will be very interesting for sure to see what exactly does happen. But other than that, I guess that does conclude today's discussion for the hurricane outlook and discussion. Of course, watching whatever happens in the East Pacific, then off the Southeast coast and the Atlantic. So I guess we have a few things to watch for June, but of course, nothing crazy besides that. And of course, as we go on into hurricane season, that'll begin to uptick itself and we'll see activity progressively as usual. Activity will progressively get more and more active, and especially in a year like this with the La Nina and a very warm Atlantic, things could definitely get interesting for sure. But other than that, that concludes today's discussion for the Hurricane Outlook and Discussion. I'm Danilo Evangelista. We'll be back again tomorrow, of course, to talk more, and of course, every day, and I promise every day for sure, after today, we'll be posting as much as we can. All right, stay tuned. Like, subscribe, comment, all those great things. Share. Peace, love, and kindness to all, and we'll talk again later. Bye.